talk about the question of church and state. And I'm going to start with a quotation, a long quotation from my book, the Defense of the Monarchy. It's not about the monarchy in practice. Well, you'll see what it's about. So, I start off from Newman's perhaps most famous piece of writing, which is nice and short. Everyone can read it, sitting in front of the internet, his big Lieto speech. So he made it on the 12th of May, 1879, and in the context of his being made a cardinal. So, big Lieto is a place in Rome where he gave his speech. And he said, well, this is a quotation from him. It must be recollected that the religious sects which sprang up in England 3 centuries ago, and which are so powerful now, have ever been fiercely opposed to the union of church and state, and would advocate the un-Christianizing of the monarchy and all that belongs to it, under the notion that such a catastrophe would make Christianity much more pure and much more powerful. So that's good. Newman's focus in this speech is what he calls liberalism, which he defines as religious indifferentism. In his words in the same speech, that I quote again, liberalism in religion is a doctrine that there is no positive truth in religion, but one creed is as good as another, unquote. Perhaps you may have heard people say such things. Liberals, accordingly, find intolerable the manifestation of any particular religious creed by the state, because this places one religion ahead of others. Newman connects liberalism in its British manifestation with the political reality of religious pluralism. As he explains, and I quote again, every dozen men taken at random whom you meet in the streets has a share in political power, as their voters. When you inquire into their forms of belief, perhaps they represent one or another of as many as 7 religions. Baptists, Methodists, Anglicans, what have you. How can they possibly act together in municipal or in national matters if each insists on the recognition of his own religious denomination? Unquote. The conceptual connection between liberalism and British Protestant non-conformity is less clear. The splintering of the religious landscape after the Reformation was a result of the state's failure to suppress Protestant dissent, as well as its failure to suppress Catholicism. But that was not a result that dissenters themselves planned or designed. The earlier ones, at least, would have preferred everyone to agree with them, and thereafter to have used state power to preserve the purity of religion, as happened in Calvin's Geneva and Puritan New England. But as their thinking developed, many of them found themselves opposed to the institution of monarchy in the context of the execution of King Charles I in 1649, and came to reject the public manifestation of religion, including the religious symbolism that continued to be associated with the monarchy after the Restoration. I cannot delve too deeply into the seething cauldron of debate among 17th century Protestants, but this is explained a little more elsewhere in the book, where James Bogle discusses the Protestant use of the phrase soli Deo Gloria. I don't follow this person on Twitter, but I'm aware of a certain Christian who calls himself 5 solas, and he's always banging on about the 5 solas of, really hot Protestantism. One of which is soli Deo Gloria, another one, of course, is sola scriptura. I remember the other ones, they're too boring, really. But anyway, soli Deo Gloria, they think this means to God alone be glory. And this, of course, is going to segue into an advert for Latin Man Society's Latin learning resources, because it doesn't mean that. It's 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 17 says, Immortali invisibili soli Deo honor et gloria, which means honor and glory to the immortal, invisible, one God. So soli here means one God, as opposed to only God, as opposed to anyone else. Nevertheless, the phrase was used to reject the giving of glory or veneration, not only to God, but to God, to the exclusion of the saints and human leaders. A radical spiritual and political egalitarianism, a total rejection of the hierarchical principle. The kind of Protestant who wanted to advance this slogan was, for example, often opposed to the office of bishop. But the principle did not stop there, leading King James I and VI to make his famous remark, "No bishops, no king." You get rid of the bishops, I'll be next. One anecdote will suffice to illustrate the theory. The historian of Protestantism, Alec Ryrie, recounts the story of a 17th century Quaker serving girl called Elizabeth Andrews, who refused to curtsy to her employer, Lord Newport. That's the quotation from Ryrie. He teasingly offered her £20 if she would. She replied that even if he offered her his entire estate, and this is a quotation from this Elizabeth Andrews, "I durst not do it, for all honour belongeth to God." So, that's taking this to its logical conclusion. This idea is part of Protestantism's radical disintermediation, the stripping out of those persons or institutions which stand, in some sense, between God and the individual believer. The individual is to discern God's will directly from the Bible or from private inspiration, without the guidance of the church as an authoritative interpreter, or a bishop, or a pope as having teaching authority. The individual is to pray to God directly without the mediation of the Blessed Virgin Mary, or the saints, or the angels, or the public prayer of the church. The individual is saved, if he is saved, directly by God, without the need for the human institution of the church or a sacramental system. Now, this is not incompatible with the use of a rite of baptism, which of course is, for example, as long as this is understood as only a sign, not something either necessary for salvation or really efficacious, causing a genuine regeneration, a rebirth, a washing away of original sin. Then again, traditions of interpretation, theologically authoritative individuals, and institutional structures inevitably arose among radical Protestantism. You just can't stop them. But they were always ad hoc and fragile, and this kind of Protestantism is highly fissiparous. The ability of Protestants to accept all kinds of formal arrangements, including even bishops on occasion, without believing in them in the traditional way, is a confusing aspect of the situation. A 17th century moderate Puritan, like Edmund Wimble, who rejected the sacrament of holy orders, could assume the title of Archbishop of Canterbury, which he did under Queen Elizabeth I. He spent most of his time sitting in his palace in London because actually, having appointed him, she decided she didn't like him after all. That's just mentioned. Anyway, he accepted this title as an administrative convenience, or perhaps as a symbolic or a decorative feature of the Anglican system, which would reassure religious conservatives, while not thinking there was anything intrinsically problematic about religious communities which did not have bishops. Now, of course, if you think about it, Anglicans don't have any trouble with religious communities who don't have bishops, and that's been a feature, has been a belief maintained by most of his successors down to the present day. This contrasts very much with St. Thomas Aquinas' hierarchical vision of the world. The hierarchy of celestial spheres, of the angelic choirs, of the church, of the family, of temple rulers, is one in which each link in the chain is causally efficacious. It is a real moving part, a link in the causal chain. As I noted elsewhere in the book, the scientific model of the day, of Aquinas' day, stressed simultaneous causation. The hand moving a stick, which moves the stone all at the same time. We might prefer to think of a line of dominoes or a cable carrying an electrical signal. In other kinds of hierarchy, a leapfrogging of intermediate steps might be possible and occasionally necessary. A field marshal can command a private soldier, for example. But this does not make the other ranks redundant, and it is not in any sense better for the command to come back directly from the top than going through the intermediate ranks in the normal way. The archaic scientific paradigm Aquinas worked with should not blind us to the significance of the contrast between his view and the radical Protestant one. Archbishop Grindal viewed the succession of bishops, as I just noted, as spiritually non-functional, with the real work being done directly between God and the individual believer. The scientific parallel would be to see in the succession of falling dominoes, one domino as not having any real causal power over the next domino, but each being toppled over directly by God. This view, called occasionalism, is the application to science of the principle of what I call disintermediation. The only real causation is that of God, as opposed to what Aquinas called secondary causation. This scientific instinct was a good fit for Catholicism because, as Catholic theologians had been insisting for many centuries, by the time they discovered Aristotle, that is, in the 11th century, the sacraments and the individual believer are not just play acting. They have real causal significance in the economy of salvation, something which is true alongside the reality that it is all ultimately radically dependent on God. The parallel holds true in all the areas of life in which there are intermediaries between the individual and God. Part of the motivation for Protestant disintermediation is to focus all attention upon God. Another part is to turn attention away from created things. God alone deserves glory because, on this view, the whole of creation is radically corrupted by sin. Catholics too believe that sin has affected the world in a profound way, but not in such a way that, for example, it is inappropriate to use art to praise God or reason to investigate Him. These created things can be purified, even redeemed. For the radical Protestant, this is impossible, so the purity of religion consists of removing created things from it as much as possible. This explains Newman's description of the Protestant sects, that they think a de-Christianized monarchy would, and I quote again, make Christianity much more pure and much more powerful, unquote. They might concede that the monarchy, or something like it, some sort of political system, is politically necessary, but they would much rather it had no place in the public manifestation of religion. In a similar way, they would rather find music or subtle intellectual endeavour, or complex hierarchy, if these must exist, have no place in evangelization. It is inappropriate to place any of these things between the individual believer and Almighty, because as created things, they are affected by sin and associated with human pride. Of course, created things cannot be entirely evicted from religious affairs, but the general tendency of thought leads to radical simplification in music, art, and architecture, and to anti-intellectualism and egalitarianism. The hope, as Newman expressed it, is that a purified religion will be much more powerful because the extraneous elements, on their view, are holding it back. The force of this way of thinking is well expressed by the influential modern Lutheran theologian Karl Barth, saying not only that philosophical arguments for the existence of God don't work, or don't produce genuine philosophical faith, or get in the way of a trusting acceptance of God's self-revelation. Rather, he says that a philosophical argument for the existence of God would, if accepted, lead the philosopher to believe not in God at all, but in a false God, an idol of his own making. Human reason as an intermediary between the individual and God would actually divert the individual away from God towards something else entirely, something positively evil. You see the parallel there with the church as exercising authority over the interpretation of Scripture or something like that. So you have this intermediary, it's going to push you in the wrong direction. The long transition from the world of the 13th century to the present was characterized by the rise of individualism. This may have been driven, above all, by economic and technological developments, but the process was defended and justified, and opposition to it brushed aside by reference to ideology. Notably, the claim that those things which impede individualism represent unreasonable restrictions on liberty and are an affront to the dignity of the individual. This ideology, as we experience it today, is the descendant of the claims of radical Protestantism of now 4 centuries or 5 centuries ago. Similarly, while only a small remnant of hardline Protestants, found on Twitter, today still believe in the radical depravity of the created world, in aesthetic judgments, the association of purity with simplicity is still culturally powerful. Of course, we've just had a counter-example to that in Palestrina. The cultural history of England and of Anglicanism has been characterised by a prolonged struggle between the tendency to simplify, to cut down, individualise and equalise, and attempts to retain or recover complexity, decoration and hierarchy, often with reference either to the Catholic past or Catholic influences from abroad. The British monarchy is the outstanding example of something preserved from the Catholic past. It is not just that it stands in politics and law between the individual and the God from whom all power comes. Any head of state will do this on Christian principles, but that this mediation is not something to be played down and be embarrassed about, but to celebrate and venerate. This institution is an affront to the radical Protestant instinct, which would say that if a leader is absolutely necessary, he should be distinguished as little as possible from everyone else, because he represents a danger of venerating something other than God, and something created and therefore evil. On the contrary, the Catholic instinct is that the means by which, in the circumstances of our own history and traditions, God's authority is mediated to us is worthy of veneration precisely because God is worthy of veneration. Angels and saints, even our Blessed Lady herself, are nothing without the grace of God. Since God's grace has made them something, the Catholic principle says, let us recognise this fact by according them the respect which possessing this grace makes them deserve. The Pope, the bishops, and the clergy in general are nothing without God's grace, and may not even be worthy individuals, but their office gives them genuine dignity, because it was established by God to make possible our spiritual government and the sacraments. The king, too, whatever his personal qualities, warrants our respect, because the office he holds is a glorious one. God has made it so, by giving him the position in accordance with law and custom. Thus far, my book. My interest today is not in the monarchy itself, but the general principle which the monarchy is, of which the monarchy is an example, which Newman defended. To recapitulate, Newman pointed out that the nonconformists wanted to secularize the state, not only because of the practical problem of the state having a specific religious identity when the population had a variety of religions, but because this would purify, quotation marks, religion. What they meant by this was a rejection of the hierarchical principle. The hierarchical principle is the idea that not only is God the ultimate originator of power and glory in church and state, but that his rule is mediated to us through these human institutions. I stress the church as a human institution as well as the divine one, because it is the church as a human institution which causes the problems. Imperfect, not to say corrupt, leadership makes all kinds of mistakes despite the church's ultimate infallibility. The state is obviously a human institution and generally works along very human lines with very little respect for God or his law. And yet, St. Paul tells us, even the power of Nero, a persecutor of the church, derived from God and could not legitimately be resisted. St. Paul does not mean that Nero could morally do whatever he likes, such as kicking his wife down the stairs and marrying his castrated male lover, which of course, as you all know, he actually did. A ruler's power is given to him only to fulfill God's mandate. This allows him a certain latitude and obvious things that rulers tend to want to do anyway, such as maintaining law and order, but it is not a license to do anything he wants to do at all. Power must be used for the good of the community, including its ultimate spiritual good, which is the salvation of its members. It is because of this that the state needs the guidance of the church, and the church needs the assistance of the state, giving rise to the traditional terminology used by Newman of the union of church and state. It has come to quite a pass that the phrase union of church and state, which for centuries was a perfectly standard encapsulation of Catholic teaching, is today in danger of conjuring up all sorts of worries and misconceptions, even among faithful Catholics. I even remember the late Cardinal Pell saying that what we need is a separation of church and state to protect the church from the state. I don't want to pick him out for special criticism because this type of talk is very common. But it would have Newman rolling in his reliquaries. In 1885, 6 years after Newman's obligative speech, quote, Pope Leo XIII, quoting with approval, Pope Gregory XVI, who was writing himself half a century earlier in 1832. And here's Leo. On the question of the separation of church and state, the same pontiff, that's Gregory, writes as follows. So this is Gregory XVI. Nor can we hope for happier results, either for religion or for the civil government, from the wishes of those who desire that the church be separated from the state and the concord between the secular and ecclesiastical authority be dissolved. It is clear that these men who yearn for a shameless liberty live in dread of an agreement between church and state, which has always been fraught with good and advantageous alike to sacred and civil interests. So that's the internal quotation and from there. Part of the confusion is simply terminological. Neither Newman nor anyone else using the expression union of church and state had in mind a merging of church and state. As I noted, Pell was concerned about the church's potential loss of liberty from too close an association with the state. The men of Newman's time knew all about this possibility, and they called it Erastianism. It is what had happened to the Church of England and the various other Protestant state churches of Northern Europe. Leo XIII was extremely keen on the liberty of the church. He inherited the prayers after low mass, which had been instituted by his predecessor, Pius IX, to beg God's intercession to save the papal state, and felt the loss of the papal state keenly, for the same reasons that opponents of the church rejoiced at it. This because this loss undermined the church's freedom. Anyone who doubts this should reflect on the fact that the capture of Rome brought to a premature end the First Vatican Council in 1870, and that council could not be reconvened until the church of Rome, in a Rome occupied by a hostile foreign power. Leo XIII mandated the prayers after low mass for the whole church. They had originally been said only in the papal state, and composed a new collect in 1886, which we still use today, focused on, and I quote, the liberty and exaltation of our Holy Mother, the Church, libertate et exaltatione sancte matris ecclesiae. The so-called Roman question of the papacy needing to be freed from the temporal power of the King of Italy was eventually resolved, as we all know, by the Lateran Pact in 1929 with the creation of the Vatican City State. In a similar way, Pope Leo and his predecessors and successors pointed out that the Church does not have full liberty to carry out her divine mandate to teach and sanctify under the legal conditions of many Christian countries after the Reformation and the French Revolution. The Church was at various times forbidden to have schools in post-revolutionary France. Members of the Latin Mass Society know that one of our heavenly patrons, the Welsh martyr St. Richard Gwyn, was a Catholic teacher during a period in which Catholics were forbidden to be teachers in this country. Nor is this problem only something of many years ago. The proto-martyr of Argentina, St. Hector Valdivieso Saez of the De La Salle brothers, was shot by communists for teaching catechism to children in Spain in 1936. In the area of education, it might seem that what the Church needs is a state which is officially neutral between different philosophies of life and will therefore allow children to be taught by all sorts of people. Pope Leo might have responded by pointing out that the Church's divine mandate to teach in the context of Catholic countries such as France or Italy or Spain cannot be fully discharged if she is merely one among many competing providers of education. In any case, the theory of state neutrality was being articulated for the first time at this very period. Its seminal text is John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, which had been published in 1859. The post-revolutionary governments of France and Italy that Pope Leo was tangling with had no intention of allowing an educational free-for-all. They wanted to inculcate revolutionary values into this new generation with centralised and compulsory state education from which the Church was to be excluded as quickly as suitable lay teachers could be brought in to replace Catholic clergy and religious. We're heading in a very similar direction in this country now. But this is, by the by, when we consider the other example Pope Leo appeals to of marriage. As he points out, hostile states, and I quote from Leo, claim jurisdiction over the marriages of Catholics, even over the bond, as well as the unity and indissolubility of matrimony. Unquote. Just as the Church has the mandate to teach, so she has the mandate to judge and is given power over the sacrament. We have become so used to the idea of the state granting divorces to Catholic couples that we have perhaps forgotten how outrageous this is. We comfort ourselves with the thought that civil divorces have no effect on the bond of marriage. That is true, which can be dissolved by no human power. But the reality is that the state withdraws its recognition of the marriage after a divorce has been decreed and proceeds to make arrangements for the division of property and the custody of children, which may be wholly unjust. Again, civil divorce acts as a powerful encouragement for Catholic couples to break up their marriages at the first sign of trouble and to seek new illicit unions, which is directly opposed to their spiritual good. The entire business of the regulation of marriage is undertaken by the state on the basis of a willful inability to recognise the reality of the marital state, resulting in a total confusion about who is genuinely married and who is not. The state's claim to govern marriage is an assault on the prerogatives granted to the Church by Christ himself and has had objectively calamitous consequences. The point of a union of church and state is that there be cooperation between the two of such a kind that the church has the liberty to do those things Christ has mandated to do, alongside a recognition by the state of the truth of the Catholic religion. This last may be more or less symbolic, crucifixes in courtrooms and prayers to begin sessions in legislature and so on. Pope Leo explains in a quotation. The Church indeed deems it unlawful to place the various forms of divine worship on the same footing as the true religion, but does not on that account condemn those rulers who, for the sake of securing some great good or hindering some great evil, allow patiently custom, or usage to be a kind of sanction for each kind of religion having its place in the state. And, in fact, the Church is wont to take earnest heed that no one shall be forced to embrace the Catholic faith against his will. For, as Augustine wisely reminds us, man cannot believe otherwise than of his own will. Short of a full union of church and state, many of the advantages of such an arrangement can be secured with a concordat, such as has governed the relationship between the church and a number of states for many years, and continues to do so even today. A concordat, of course, is not something that any state would enter into with a religious community like the Methodists. It is in itself a recognition of the unique status of the Catholic Church and of the Holy See as a sovereign entity. In this way, the union of church and state leaves the two as distinct things, as with the union of husband and wife, or of soul and body. This phrase should not be understood to imply either the domination of the church over the state's temporal responsibilities, or of the state over the church's spiritual functions. It recognises all the same interdependence of the temporal and the spiritual, and the importance of close cooperation. The cooperation will take on its fullest form in the confession of the Catholic state, but to some degree it exists between the church and the states with no stated religious affiliation or affiliation to a religion other than the Catholic faith. Examples of non-Catholic states acting to secure spiritual goods in accordance with the teaching of the church would include the state's repression of religious scams, such as abusive cults, and the prohibition of religious proselytism using force, fraud, brainwashing, or bribery. More positive examples would be giving the church a privileged tax status, perhaps alongside other long-standing religious communities, and taking the church into partnership in the running of schools and hospitals. Indeed, the only people who could really object to this kind of thing are the more fanatical advocates of French laïcité and of the American separation of church and state. These individuals need to realise that even in France and the United States, cooperation of these sorts does happen in practice and always has. For example, where the state pays for people to use Catholic hospitals in America, or pays for maintenance of historic church buildings in France, and the appointment of military chaplains. It is amusing to recall that the President of the French Republic is ex officio a canon of the Lateran Basilica, a privilege he inherits from France's kings on the terms of the Republic Concordat with the Holy See. It has, of course, been a while since the French head of state took the position up. Who knows, when the dust settles on France's latest set of political upheavals, whether a president might emerge who would actually occupy his seat in the Pope's cathedral as members of the Order of the Garter take their places in special services in the Chapel Royal Windsor. We should beware of accepting the triumph of secularism too readily as Catholics. Not only is it contrary to the Church's traditions, but even today that triumph is far